Hi, we continue in Luke 24 today as we enter into the wonderful story of the two on the road to Emmaus who encounter the risen Jesus but don't know who it is until they discover it in the breaking of the bread. So, on the right side of the screen you can see some of the questions we've been looking at that I went over in some detail in the introductory video to this unit of Luke 24. Really encourage you to watch that video if you haven't. Today we're going to focus on a couple of things that are revealed in this story in particular. One is number 6 here. What does Luke's narrative suggest is the nature of a risen body? And we'll look at that today a little bit in contrast with the nature of an angelic body as seen in the book of Tobit, which may well have been written roughly around the same time as Luke was, although it's hard to say. And then we'll look at some other aspects of this as we see later. But one of the things that I want to really focus on today is not so much that as it is the shape of this story and how unique it is to Luke. As I've been noting throughout this unit, all the gospel writers tell their resurrection stories in their own way. Mark doesn't have a resurrection story, only an empty tomb. John, as I noted last time, has Mary Magdalene have the first experience, and then there are other stories in John 21 about meeting Jesus on the beach, etc. And Matthew has his own stories, but this is a story unique to Luke and really nowhere else, and perhaps one of the most popular stories in Luke's gospel, a gospel full of stories that are very popular, like the prodigal son story. And it's shaped into this very nicely organized chiasm down to the F level, as you can see here, at the same hour, the same day, and from Jerusalem matching. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him there. And today, their questions where they encounter the risen Jesus, asking them those questions, and their responses here. And so that's as much as we're going to look at today, and next time we'll begin to enter into these elements. And one of the things we need to note as we enter into this story is we can't really address the question or try to answer it, did this really happen? I noted last time and in the introductory video the question of does it matter whether resurrection really happened, and that's something that each interpreter has to decide for themselves. It's certainly my view that resurrection is both essential to the story and essential to the kind of faith that the gospel writers are trying to encourage in their audience. But as I've been noting throughout the series here, we can't say whether Jesus said or did any particular things. There's just no way to link these particular words from 2,000 years ago with the events behind the words. And yet this story in particular has the kind of mythic folkloric resonances that we could see in many kinds of stories. In particular, for Luke's audience, there are stories of the gods being a disguise among people for various purposes, usually for the gods' own purposes, but there are many stories of that, not dying and rising gods, but gods in disguise as humans. But I'd like to suggest that a story in the scriptures, although in the Apocrypha, and because it's from the Septuagint, not in the Hebrew Bible, is the book of Tobit, which involves these elements, as you can see here, extracted from the book. I didn't put the chapters and verses from Tobit here, but I did put them in the order in which they appear. And if you don't know the book of Tobit, I won't get into the whole business of it, but a father has a son who wants to marry a woman who's had 7 husbands who've each died on the wedding night, and it's attributed, as you can see in this opening verse here, to a demon. And so he's looking for a way to heal that, and we're told here he found Raphael, the angel, but he didn't know it was an angel. And later on we see these various elements, as I've noted here, connected to what the images and words we hear in Luke 24. And although it's a very different story, it's not a story about dying and rising, and Raphael in this case is there to heal, as you can see at the top, to scale away the white films from Tobit, the father's eyes, and to give Sarah the daughter in marriage, and to bind the demon here. There are elements I'd like to suggest, as noted in red, that are contrasting here between the angel's appearance in Tobit and Jesus' appearance in the story, for the very purpose of highlighting that the risen Jesus is not like an angel. And so 2 elements in red. One is that Raphael identifies himself. I am Raphael, one of the 7 holy angels, something we hear about Gabriel do as well, especially in the beginning of Luke. We heard Gabriel announce himself to Mary and to Zechariah, we heard. But Jesus in this chapter does not ever identify himself. It's an interesting element that the only time the name Jesus is actually said in the story is when Cleopas is reciting to the stranger, who of course is the risen Jesus, "Are you not the only one who doesn't know these things about Jesus of Nazareth?" That's the only time Jesus is mentioned out loud in the entire chapter, which I think is interesting. But Raphael is named out loud here. In addition, we hear Raphael noting that although you thought I was just a person, all these days I merely appeared to you and did not eat or drink, but you were seeing a vision. And that might fit the so-called Docetist views that emerged in the 2nd century, and some scholars reading Acts think that Luke was writing in the face of Docetic views when he wrote Acts, perhaps later than Luke. I won't get into those questions now. There's certainly the great contrast between Raphael, who names that he does not eat or drink, and Jesus in the face of their thinking that he's a pneuma, a spirit, not a ghost as it's translated, but a spirit, asks if they have food, and they give him food to eat. And so the risen Jesus is not an angel and not a spirit, and perhaps that's what's going on here. And notice it continues with further resonance. I am ascending to the one who sent me, and after that ascension they confess the great and wonderful works like they do after Jesus is risen and ascended. So there's certainly a number of important elements there. And another thing we'll see here is the second of the 4 rhetorical questions we see and that link Luke 24 with Acts 1. We saw the 2 men at the tomb in white say to the women, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And now we'll hear Jesus say, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" Perhaps that's not exactly a rhetorical question, as the first one is, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And so perhaps that's not technically accurate, but certainly these 4 questions frame the whole unit. And then finally, as we've been looking at the echoes of chapter 1 and 2, and as Bukhar notes, not in this note, but in another note I'll just show in a second, nearly everything that Cleopas says echoes things we've heard earlier in the story because he's reciting the things about Jesus. But less explicit than that are these kinds of echoes, like the question of open eyes and what eyes can see there, and the question of redemption and how that redemption might take place. So I'll put up the chiastic element, and as I was noting in the introductory video, in addition to noting the chiastic framework here as well as the key words, so the chiastic frameworks are the elements in with a colored background, and the key words are the elements where the key words are colored. The part in black are the rare or unique words that are used in this chapter, almost never anywhere else except 1 or 2 examples as given here. And there are even more than I had when I first posted it, so I posted a revised one to note that this one, homoloon, there is also one that's only on these immediate verses, and then one other time in Acts, 2 times in Acts in the New Testament. So let's jump right into our story here. As Bukhar notes below, Mark 16:12-13, which is the longer ending of Mark, the traditional understanding of Mark is ending at 16:8, has this brief story. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And you can see that he's suggesting that's the first commentary on the Emmaus story, which notes the glory that is not visible here. And he says, quote, "First, as long as the disciples conceive of Jesus as the prophet who disappointed Israel's messianic expectations, they remain unable to bear the brilliance of his glory." And he goes on to compare the account of Moses coming down from Sinai in the 2nd century document, we don't need to know all the names of these things, where Moses is said to be bathed in invisible light which the people cannot see as an expression of their incomprehension. As he notes further, as with the initial revelation, the infancy stories, the resurrection gospel comes not to the well-known figures but to the women and these 2 unknowns. Actually, that's my note, not Bukhar's note. So we'll see that there are a couple of reasons given here for scholars see for why the disciples don't recognize Jesus. One is they don't have the right faith, and I'll suggest right away, it's no big surprise, it's because they aren't following the right biblical narrative. And also, as a number of scholars have noted from their own experience working with people who were oppressed by empire, they're deeply traumatized. They had put everything they had on the hope that Jesus would be the one to redeem them from the Romans, and now he's dead. And it's a terrible trauma they're experiencing. And in that moment, this is, after all, less than 48 hours or so from the crucifixion. We're still on that Easter day, as the narrator tells us right here at the beginning of our story. We can only imagine how these people are feeling. They're not just walking along having a chat trying to figure out, but their hopes that God would intervene to save them from the Romans have been dashed. So with them in trauma and carrying the wrong story, we enter into our passage. So now, on the same day, and it's kaidu here, stronger than, and behold, the second of 3 in the chapter, clearly drawing a distinction that we're starting a new passage now. And the same day, highlighting the simultaneity of this experience with the Jerusalem experience, which will come out when they return and find that while they were with the risen one in Emmaus, he was also with those in Jerusalem. And we'll look at that and what that implies when we get there, about risen bodies and about the space-time continuum. So they were going to a village, and their going here frames the entire gospel with Mary's journey to Elizabeth in 139. That's not one I listed here under the parallels because the verb for to go there is a normal everyday verb, but it certainly is a connection in the beginning. People are leaving their comfort zone and going out into a new place. And in this case, a village called Emmaus, framing with verse 28 and the chiasm here, as we can see, called Emmaus. And scholars have speculated about that. Fitzmyer suggests two possible places. One, Emmaus, where Judas Maccabee attacked the Syrian and Philistine forces. And another, spelled the same way, 30 stadia from Jerusalem, which is, say, 3.5 miles northwest, where Vespasian settled 800 veterans. I'd suggest it doesn't really matter. Emmaus here is not about an actual physical place that nobody in Luke's audiences certainly know, although one could ask why it's named as a place 7 miles from Jerusalem, but we know very little about that. The 7 miles here is translating 60 stadia there, that measure. We see stadia a couple of other times as a measure. It's interesting, there aren't very many measures of distance in Luke, but this is highlighting this would be a couple-hour walk at most, for people in their world could easily walk 4 miles an hour. So perhaps a couple miles, although they're probably not walking at full speed, and their goal might not be to be getting there, their goal might be just to be getting out of Jerusalem. And so they're talking with each other, using the word here, homilun here, only here in verse 15. You can hear it's the verb form, but you might recognize the noun form homily to give a talk in church. They're talking with each other. And one of the interesting contrasts is, although they're talking with each other, in a moment we'll hear that only one of them speaks up. And that's in sharp contrast with the women that we saw previously, who had great solidarity, that everything they saw and did and spoke was done as a group, and there was no distinction made. So among these two, only one of whom is named, and we'll look at that in a moment, but only one of the two will talk. So right now they're talking with each other about all these things that had happened. Using another rare word here, as you can see also on the right side of the screen here, sunbakoton here. Why Luke uses that unusual word when there's other words he uses, because there are things describing these things that had happened throughout, but I can't answer that question. So that's the context, that they're having this conversation about the things that had happened. We can only imagine what they're saying here. And while they're talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. As Maxey comments below, although the identity of the stranger remains a mystery to the disciples throughout most of this episode, the narrator takes the readers aside to let them know clearly and emphatically that this stranger is Jesus himself. Such a gesture by the narrator confirms what the readers have experienced elsewhere when they are given special insight. And yet, as we'll see, we're given special insight, but the people talking to Jesus are given different special insight. Our eyes are open to see it's Jesus while theirs are closed, but their ears are open to hear what he says, and ours are shielded from it because the narrator doesn't tell us. So there's an interesting mix of eyes and ears and what we know and don't know. So while they're talking and discussing, and the word for discussing here is susateo, is otherwise used negatively in the sense of arguing, as we saw back in the Jerusalem ministry in 22-23. We'll see it similarly in Acts. And it wouldn't be surprising they're arguing amongst themselves. It wouldn't be surprised if they're arguing amongst themselves heatedly and angrily, but what we're going to hear is a different emotion. Jesus himself came near. This is actually the narrator telling us it's Jesus here, much like we saw in the Tobit passage. The narrator tells us it was Raphael, but they didn't know it. So we know it, and he came near and went with him. How are we supposed to imagine that happen? They're out walking on an open road. We don't know how far they've gone yet away from Jerusalem, but they're on a road, and out of nowhere this person appears, and they don't seem at all surprised about that. So the first thing we can say about this risen body is it just looks like an ordinary person. There's nothing special about it. Maybe there should be a glory they can see, and that was the suggestion of the note from Bakura I said earlier, like Moses coming down, or like when they saw Jesus on the Transfiguration mountain. But maybe they just can't see the glory. So maybe if he was risen and they could really see it, they would see it. But as my wife Sue says, as spiritual director, what people see with the eyes of God's love, you can see that glory around anybody, not just a risen body. So that might not be just the nature of a risen body here. But certainly the nature is that it looks like an ordinary body, and we'll see later in the chapter it makes a point of saying not a spirit and can eat, as I was noting in contrast with Raphael in Tobit. So he came near and went with them. Sunoporeto, literally to journey with. So he's going with them on the way. And the narrator gives us another piece of information, and this is framed, as I was noting, chiastically down here. Their eyes were kept from recognizing. And scholars have spilled a lot of ink to try to resolve this question. Is it divine passive, as chance below suggests it usually is? But he asks, quote, but is it not so much God who kept them from recognizing the resurrection one as their attachment to an image of God, an image interwoven with a particular myth of redemption? And that's going to be my point, that whether we call it the prophetic trajectory, as Walter Brueggemann called it a half century ago, or the myth of biblical radicalism, as Chad Myers called it in the 80s and early 90s, or the religion of empire, as I call it in my 2010 book, Come Out My People, we're going to hear there's a different script, so to speak, of the scripture they need to hear in order to recognize what's going on. Serena Jones, writing from a perspective of women of color being oppressed, notes their trauma prevents them from, quote, making sense of things. And I think that's exactly right, and I appreciate her insight there. Kept from recognizing, and we'll see that recognizing comes back chiastically at the other side. And so he speaks to them. Out of nowhere, he speaks, and they don't seem surprised at all that the stranger is speaking to them. My note below notes that Alana's, writing from the Texas border, sees this as a, quote, sacred third space. As she says, quote, a creative space where new epiphanies occur, new visions are acquired, new perspectives gains, and conversions erupt. In other words, a liminal space, a place between the death and resurrection consciousness, if you will. They're aware of the death, but they're not aware of the resurrection. Between Jerusalem and the world beyond Jerusalem. And so that's what we're going to see here in this space. And so he says to them, with wonderful irony that certainly the original audience must have gotten a chuckle out of, what are you discussing with each other while you walk along? Literally, what word is this? I'm using antabalete here for discussing, only here in the New Testament, and different, as we noted from the word up there, while you walk along. And notice the highlighting that they're walking along. He could have just said, what are you talking about? But the highlight, just as the narrator noted that they were talking while they were going, and that Jesus came and went with them, and now it emphasizes that they're talking while they're walking, and he will be continuing that. And perhaps that's meant, although it's not explicit, to highlight a biblical metaphor that isn't central to Luke but is adjacent to Luke, which is to walk in the way of Yahweh, as you can see from this example, is to experience a life of faith. Luke doesn't use that image, but he does use the image of the way, hodos, and we hear that explicitly in Acts, or the way of Jesus. So if you're on a way, you're certainly walking on it. They're not driving on it. So perhaps that's related. While you walk along, while you're wondering what your journey of faith is. And the response is to stop. They stood still, looking sad. Using, again, a word only one other place. Looking sad. And their sadness, of course, was there before this moment, I'm sure, but their sadness, as we're going to hear, is how can this person not know what seems to be the only topic worth talking about? And if you've been through an earthquake or a fire or political violence of some kind, you can certainly imagine what it would be like for someone just kind of casually wondering what you're talking about when it seems like there's only one possible topic. But of course, for the larger audience in Jerusalem, it is not the only possible topic. And the reality is that most people would not even noticed. The crucifixion took place outside of town. The Passover is still ongoing. And so it's very possible that whether the Jerusalem pilgrims or the local people who live in Jerusalem or the Roman officials didn't even know it was happening. But from their perspective, in their sadness, it's the only show in town. And so now we get a chance to hear them speak. And as Maxie notes, as I was suggesting earlier, almost every utterance of Cleopas leads the reader to recall earlier episodes. Then one of them, and it's an interesting contrast that the narrator makes a choice here. Could have said they said, just like we heard the women they said, but here it's one of them. And so the solidarity is broken here, and only one is named. And the name Cleopas, as Fitzmyer suggests, a shortened form of the Greek Cleopatras in the masculine form, suggesting perhaps an Egyptian person. But others, Marshall suggests, related to the Semitic form Klopas, which we hear in John's Gospel, the mother of Klopas at the foot of the cross, which leads some to suggest this is a man and the other is his wife and is a woman, which leads many women scholars to suggest that Luke is repressing the female here in the face of the male voice. That's all speculation, but it's certainly possible parable, but we know nothing about the person that Cleopas is with. If, in response to that issue of repressing the woman's voice, one might ask why in Acts then we hear about Aquila and Priscilla, or Prissa, as she sometimes said, a married couple who were both in ministry together and both named. So one of them, whose name is Cleopas, answered, "Are you the only stranger?" Parokais here, a verb often meaning, quote, to inhabit a place without citizenship, dwell as a resident alien. It can also be used of temporary visitors. So it can be Jerusalem pilgrims, or it can be people who have migrated there for one reason or another, just as we see so many people migrating to cities when they've been displaced by war or famine or other things. But that's how they perceive him, that he must be a stranger, otherwise he would know. Or is it something that he looks like? It's hard to know. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem, where they're not at the moment, who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? Using a phrase that echoes back to the beginning, and interestingly is only in the book of Zechariah, anywhere in the Hebrew Scripture, the particular phrase, hemares tautas, these days. And so we'll stop there before we hear Jesus' answer, which is to put the question back to them, like the good therapist that he's acting as here, to heal them of their blindness. We'll continue there next time. See you then.